Okay, hello everybody. It is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So welcome and good afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you're coming in from. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director here at PON. And today we are going to be discussing a wonderful new work from one of our affiliate faculty members, Getting Back to the Table by Joshua Weiss. So I will be introducing Josh in just a few minutes. But first, let me give a little preamble and a welcome to anybody who might be joining us specifically for the first time today. PON has for 40 years led the world in research and pedagogy and executive trainings related to negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we're so happy to have this wonderful series of live events that we're able to bring to our community. Some courageous people may have been on the event we held yesterday on corruption in conjunction with the Weatherhead Center. And we have a whole slate of events that are taking place over the course of the semester. So thank you for being here today. And we hope that you will continue to tune in to these or watch the recordings on our website. So today's event is being recorded, and if you have to leave early, you will see it in a day or two up on our site, or if you want to recommend it to somebody else or rewatch a part or revisit some of the slides that are being shared. This is also an occasion for me to thank the incredible event staff at the Program on Negotiation who put so much work into all of these events. We've had 3 events in 24 hours, including a faculty dinner last night. So everybody's looking very fresh and excited because we've got so much stuff going on. But a big thanks to Diane Long, Lindsay Sullivan, and Laura Sampietro for all of their hard work as ever. You will notice if you have been a participant at previous events, we have actually disabled participant chat going forward, but because we want to focus everybody on the comments of our speaker. However, we still love the part where we get to know a little bit about our audience. And so to that end, I'm going to ask our team to bring up some of the polls that we've designed to get to know who's in the room and where you're coming from. So first question, where are folks tuning in from? Typically, we have a lot of North America, but not always. And I am always so grateful to the people tuning in from Asia Pacific or Australia. Goodness knows what time it is. Thank you for being with us, and we really appreciate it. Okay, lovely. So 65% North America, but a good portion for the rest of the world. Thank you very much for that first poll. And now we'll go to the second question. We've moved on to another question about people's experience in negotiation. Wanted to know if you were a faculty researcher, if you're a practitioner, or just somebody who really wanted to learn more about this topic. Okay, wonderful, and great to see so much expertise in the room. Lovely. Can we get the third question up? Oh, lovely. And have you previously attended a PON live event? Wow, a lot of never miss a one. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And quite a few people who are coming in for the first time. So thank you to everybody who is here and new. And we appreciate everyone taking time out of their lunch hour or whatever hour to be with us. All right, that's just a little bit of an intro. And now I have one last task before I hand over the floor, and that is, of course, to introduce our fabulous speaker, Dr. Joshua Weiss. He is the co-founder, along with William Ury, of the Global Negotiation Initiative at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School and a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He is also the director and creator of a Master of Science degree in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. Josh is an experienced consultant and instructor. He's the author of numerous books, including some personal favorites in my house, children's books about conflict resolution. So thank you, Josh, for training the younger generation also. And his latest book, Getting Back to the Table, takes as a premise that we shouldn't only be talking about our negotiation successes when we're talking about how to get better at negotiation, but we should actually be learning from some of the mistakes that I know you, and everyone has made and continues to make sometimes. So what can we learn from these failures? How can we restart stalled negotiations? all here in this wonderful book that I really encourage. We're putting the link in the chat in case you'd like to purchase a copy. But for now, we'll let Josh preview some of the incredible content. Josh, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nicole. It's always a pleasure to join you. So let me go ahead and share my slides here. So welcome to this talk. And like I said, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules. I know everybody has a lot to do. I just wanted to share a little bit about this new book that actually came out yesterday. As Nicole said, my focus in terms of why write this was really about um, trying to create a realistic picture of negotiation. I think for practitioners and things like that, it's pretty realistic. We all know that we're not going to succeed every time. But what's interesting is that the conversations that I had related to all this were thought provoking for me. So, 4 years ago, I wrote a book called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And in that, I looked at 25 cases of successful negotiations. And I remember speaking to somebody who said, listen, I really love your book, but why is it that you wrote about successes? Why didn't you focus in on the failures that we have? Because those are the ones that we really need to learn from. And that began to put a thought in my head that, I think there's a there. And so I started to work on it. And then one of my students said to me, I'm curious, after class one day said, What are you working on now?" And I said, well, I'm actually writing a book about failure and setbacks in negotiation and how do you cope with that and really try to learn. And she said what you see there is the second bullet on the screen, which is, thank goodness. I feel like all we read about is success. And it feels like if we don't succeed all the time, we're bad negotiators. And that comment really stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, as educators, we can't be delivering that message. We need to let people know that this is part of the negotiation landscape. And um, that way, their expectations are in line, that they're not going to succeed every time. Of course, we don't set out to fail, but we do encounter these problems and challenges. And the question is, what do we do with that, right? And so, one of the things that I started to do as I got into this was to think, let me try to create awareness about the different ways that people can fail in negotiations so that they can be looking out for these. And really, in some ways, to deepen the conversation around failure, there's definitely been some work on this. But I think we, in some way, need to normalize this conversation and help people to talk it through and to also share these failures in some way with others so that they can process and work with it. And in the end, my goal is, first of all, to help people get back to the table when it's possible. Sometimes it's possible and sometimes it's not. But also, and I think more importantly, as we all know, being a really good negotiator is a journey, it's not a destination. And so over time, I really want people to use these failures and setbacks to become better negotiators, to really think about what were the lessons here that you can take away from these experiences and not hide from what happened. So let me get into this a little more and let me begin by talking about the distinction between setbacks and failures. So for me, a setback is a breakdown of a negotiation process that can be temporary or significant, but there's a path to the negotiation table that's relatively clear. Okay. A failure, on the other hand, is really when a negotiation breaks down more permanently, and there is probably not an obvious path back to the table, at least in the near term. We hear a lot about failures, and then maybe a few years later, people re-engage or things along those lines. But there's a difference, and I think the really important thing from my point of view is that sometimes we hesitate to call something a failure because of the stigma that's attached with that. Um, but I think it's important that we kind of own it, that sometimes this negotiation, didn't go where I wanted it to go, and I didn't achieve my objective. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. In my own life, growing up, I failed a lot. And in many ways, it was actually really helpful. As I've gone through my life, I don't see failure as something that's debilitating, and I've had some good ones along the way. I see it as something that sort of made me more resilient and persistent, and that I know that I'm going to run into these kinds of problems and challenges. And so, what do I do with them? How do I really use what's gone on there and mold it and shape it so that I can get better? Now, what I encountered as I started to do some thinking about this, some talking to folks, students, trainees, other negotiators, is that there seems to be three typical responses to failure. And the analogy I'm going to use here, and I use in the book, is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So I'm assuming everybody's relatively familiar with that story, but if you're not, really briefly, Goldilocks is lost in the woods. She finds a shack, goes in, and there are three bowls of porridge. It turns out it's, the bear's home, etc. There are three bowls of porridge. One is too hot, one is too cold, and one is just right. The too hot response to failure, from my point of view and my perspective, is rationalization, that we rationalize our behavior, we blame everyone else, and we don't think that we had any hand in the failure that occurred, or we're not willing to admit that we had any hand in that. The too cold approach is one where we failed and we find it so debilitating that we either really don't want to negotiate again, or if we do negotiate again, we experience a lot of anxiety. Again, not really too helpful. We don't really learn from that. The third approach is, a just right approach where we take in the fact that we failed and we think, what do we do with this? And how do we take the lessons from it and move forward? And what's interesting, and I'll get to this a little bit later, is that a lot of times people try to learn from their failures in kind of a cursory manner. And what they're actually doing is learning the wrong lessons. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, not only with my students, but also with the people that I work with in training and helping them to prepare for their negotiations. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But learning really requires a pretty in-depth process. And that's where the 5-step come in. Now, to begin the book and to begin our conversation to go a little bit deeper when it comes to failure, I want to talk about a couple of different types that I've identified. There are actually 7 in total. And what I'm going to ask Diane to do, if she would, is pop those up there for a moment. And I'm going to ask you to kind of vote on this. So let me just walk you through this before you vote, okay? So these are 6 different kinds. I left one out for specific reasons, but let me just explain what I mean by them. And then I want you to think about which of these kinds of failures are the ones that perhaps you've experienced most often, okay? So the first one is agreement was possible and made sense for you and the other negotiators, but you didn't come to an agreement for whatever reason, okay? The second is you agreed to something that didn't meet your objectives or goals. In other words, it was probably not the best for you to agree to something like that, but you did it anyways. You reached an agreement, but damaged the relationship, and the relationship mattered, right? It wasn't a one-off negotiation. It was one where you were going to be negotiating with that person or that company or organization over and over again. You came to an agreement that was worse than your BATNA. Emotions overcame you and caused a collapse in the process. And then lastly, a hidden dynamic or unrevealed information caused a collapse, which maybe you learned about later or something along those lines. So if you could go ahead and vote, I'm curious which of these feel like, you've encountered the most over the course of your career. Okay, I don't know if we have the results of those yet, but all right, great. So let's see. The first one, 27%. The next one, 34%, and 15%. 6%, 16%, and then 34% again. Really interesting. So part of the reason that I wanted to do this is I wanted to help people to begin to think about what are the ways in which I can fail, and to go into your negotiations sort of being aware that that's some of the reality, right? And to be conscious of these things. Like I know for most of you, awareness is such an important part of what we do, right? And I've tried to give some names to these kinds of failures so they'll be easy for you to recall as you read through them going forward. So, the one where you, agree there was an agreement and a deal on the table that made sense, but you didn't get there is called slipping through the fingers failure. And one where you agreed to something that didn't meet your objective, what were you thinking failure? And the penny wise and pound foolish failure is really about when you agree to something that has a short-term gain but damages the relationship over time. So, like I said, my goal in doing this is to begin to sort of help people to say, okay, so if I know that these are the different ways I can fail, let me, keep my radar out for that. And it's not enough to just think about failure and setback here, but how bad was it? That's often what people will say to me when I've talked to them and we're talking about, can you get back to the table? I'll often say, well, how bad was this? Did you really burn a bridge and it seems impossible? And so in the book, I created a scale of 1 to 4, where the one is basically actually you sort of expected to fail because you were dealing with a really hard negotiation issue. The second one is a bit of a bump in the road, probably pretty easy to get back to the table. The third, um, on the magnitude scale, is a more difficult one. It's going to take a lot of effort to get back to the table. And the fourth is really, this is very likely a catastrophic failure. And if you're ever going to get back to the table, it's going to take quite a bit of time to do that. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to explore as I went into this was not just how do we fail, but are we really learning from our failures? And as I got into this more and more, I began to see that there were kind of three categories of reasons why we don't learn from our failures. The first one is really blame and rationalization. This is going to come up a lot. And by the way, you're going to see that if you do end up getting the book, that I spend a lot of time focused on you and the internal workings of your mind and how you're processing all of this, because this is where so much of learning from our failure rests and comes from. Right? So the first one is really that a lot of people quickly want to get into blame, and that this wasn't my fault, it was out of my hands, and things along those lines, or rationalizing your behavior. Um, if that's your default, it's really hard to learn anything because you're in a defensive mode and you're not taking in any new information or anything that will help you to say, what could I have done differently here? Similarly, there's also biases, right? And things like self-serving biases, which in effect attribute your successes to internal factors like who you are, your ability as a negotiator, but attribute negative results to external factors, right? Or negative results or failures. So if you fail, it had to be because of somebody else, or some other dynamic involved. There's also another bias called the backfire effect, where when we're challenged and maybe when we see that our perspective, there's a slight problem with it, instead of reassessing our perspective, we double down on it. We um, kind of, dig in even more when we're challenged. And again, very hard to learn when we're busy digging in and sort of trying to reinforce our position as opposed to thinking about where's this criticism coming from and what can I take from it. And then we have a tendency toward loss aversion, as has been well documented by lots of academics over the year. And the challenge is that when we are focused on loss aversion, again, we put up a barrier to learning, right? We're so worried about defending and trying to figure that out that we can't think about what happened and why. And the other reason that we don't learn from our failures is because we've developed heuristics or mental shortcuts for how we go about our negotiations. And when we do that, kind of gets in the way because, the part of the reason that we failed runs counter to those shortcuts that we've developed and that we rely so heavily on. So there are a lot of reasons why we don't learn from our failures, and they can really get in the way um, and prevent us from actually figuring out why this didn't work out in the way that we wanted it to. Okay. So the heart of the book is these 5 steps. And what I thought I would do is just very, briefly walk you through them, hoping to have more of a conversation as we go. But briefly, the 5 steps, let me just tell you what they are, and then I'll take you through them. So the first one is that in many ways you failed, accept it. Um, there's a really important reason to do this because if you don't accept that you've actually not gotten where you want to go, it's very hard to progress from there. And so grappling with it and saying, okay, I realize that I've failed. Now what is important? And there's a grieving piece to this. Now, some of you might think grieving is a pretty strong term, but it's certainly on the spectrum of grief when you don't get what you really want or need. And, some of our negotiations, of course, can be very, very high stakes, and the consequences of not getting what you need are dramatic. And so there's a really important piece of accepting it. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The second step is analyzing the forest and the trees. So really understanding what went wrong and not just leaving it to, yeah, there were a few things I could have done differently, but diving in, looking at the big picture of what kind of failure you experienced, and then what were the nuances and the minutia that you can identify that led you down a road where you didn't get where you needed to go. The third step is not just any lessons, the right ones. This is a big one from my point of view. And in working with a lot of different folks, I see them make this mistake all the time, which is that they are trying to transfer lessons from previous negotiations to upcoming ones or to this one. And they missed out on certain dynamics and other aspects of the negotiation process that were dissimilar and actually created problems for them. Once you've done that, then we go into a step that I think is really critical and really hard to do, which is to actively unlearn what your weaknesses taught you. So I try to push the envelope here a little bit, that I think there are concepts and ideas that people have learned in different ways, whether it's the media or who knows where, that might actually be getting in the way of you becoming more and more of a successful negotiator. And so that means stepping back and saying, what are the core beliefs that I have? And how do are they serving my purposes as best as possible? Or should I try to unlearn some of these? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. And then finally, return to the table smarter and stronger so that you can re-engage. What does that look like to re-engage? How do you go about it? And if you can't, how do you really learn? So on the you failed, accept it model here. Um, so this model comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and many of you have seen this. It's certainly not without controversy. The model was developed to help understand grief and to understand how people dealt with getting very negative news, even a terminal illness, that kind of thing. But it's been used in many ways to try to understand what happens when people don't succeed, right? And that's was my purpose here in trying to use this. And there's typically 5 steps. I added in a step because one of the things that I see that happens to people after they um, end up in the first piece of this, which is denial, right, is that they actually begin to experience anxiety more so than moving right to anger. So the steps are here: denial, anxiety, anger, sadness, acceptance, and then ultimately problem solving. And I use this model as a starting point, and I try to be really clear in the book because I don't believe everybody goes through all these steps. And in fact, Kubler-Ross has been criticized by saying that everybody goes through all these steps. What's happened is that people have adapted this and said, well, actually, not everybody goes through all these steps, but people go through a number of them, right? So you might start at denial, go to anxiety, and you might not be the kind of person who feels the need to express your anger or to be angry. That's not how you think. You move to sadness and perhaps problem solving, something along those lines. But there's a conversation that we're having in our head when we fail. And the key is to listen to that and to listen to, okay, if I'm in denial, what am I denying here? What am I not recognizing about the fact that this is the new reality, right? But I might be saying to myself, this is not happening. This can't be the outcome, right? And if I then move into, say, anxiety, I might be saying to myself, I feel really uneasy and uncomfortable about where I am, and I don't know what's going to happen next. There's a conversation that we have, and I've sort of identified how you might be thinking as you move your way through this. But it's really important that you deal with the grief of failure. And Longfellow stated, there's no grief like the grief that doesn't speak. And too often I see people who won't allow themselves to grieve in this way because they didn't get where they want to go. And as a result, they're sort of blocked. They can't move forward. Think about, in some ways, like a sink that gets backed up. Nothing's getting through there until you unclog the sink. And this step serves as that purpose of unclogging the feelings and the challenges that you have when you don't succeed. Okay. So that's the first step, and it's a really hard one for most people as part of this process. Now, the second is this idea of analyzing the forest and the trees, a common phrase, but I think really important when we don't succeed, we have to ask from the big picture point of view, what kind of failure did I just have? Like what was going on there? Was it the slip through your fingers kind of problem or what? And how bad was it? I think we always want to know that. Is there a route back to the table? So we want to be asking ourselves those questions, but then really important, we want to shift and get into the micro interactions, if you will, or the minutia. And here I kind of talk in the book about critical moments that Mike Wheeler and Kimberlyn Leary have done a lot of work on, and trying to identify where was the critical moment in this negotiation where there was a setback or a failure that you can identify so that you can begin to understand what happened there, what could I have done differently, or how do I, think about this as I'm considering getting back to the table. And then also, even further down the scale of getting more granular, is to look at the moves and turns that the parties took. And I think my colleague Debbie Kolb is on the call here. Debbie was one of the first to identify this idea of moves and turns. And what I found as I talked to people about their failures, they could go back to a specific interchange between themselves and the other negotiators. And they could think about what happened and why the process broke down and what they might have done differently at that point. So I think that's why this becomes so valuable. And the analysis piece is fundamental. And I think that we don't spend nearly enough time here. We want to sort of get on with our learning. So we push past this kind of quickly. And I would encourage you to slow down. And I've given in the book, there are a couple of different worksheets that you can apply your negotiations to figure out what happened and really get a good sense of all of that. Now, the third step is, again, not just any lessons, but the right ones. So what does that mean? Um, I really like this quote by John Maxwell: experience is not the best teacher, evaluated experience is. And this is something that I've seen far too often in my work where lots of people will say, that was such an important experience. And I'll sort of push them a little bit and say, well, what did you really take away? And why was it so important? And what I find is that people aren't going into that evaluated experience. They have a nugget or two that they've learned, but they're not really digging deeply down. And they're certainly not looking at their negotiation approach and saying, does this, does my approach really fit here? Did it fit here? And is it going to be helpful going forward? Because I think generally speaking, when people have an approach to negotiation, they try to stick with it, especially if it's been successful. And as we know, negotiations have a tremendous amount of differences between them. And people are often not saying, am I comparing apples to apples here in terms of using the same approach for a negotiation that has very different dynamics? In one negotiation, there's just me and another party. In another, there's four parties. And in one, there's a power asymmetry, and in the other, there's not. Um, and it can go on and on. And so it's really key that as you do this and you say, what are the lessons that I learned from that negotiation? And as you want to use those lessons, you want to be asking, and are these transferable to this next negotiation? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And the transferable thing for me too can be broken into behavior and then sort of attitudes or underlying mindset. So behavior is sort of easy to recognize, right? Um, Do I use these tactics and things along those lines? But there's also an underlying mindset that we all have, that we bring to the negotiation table. And in psychodynamic theory, there's talk of transference. And there's been some work in the negotiation journal on this, which is interesting to read. But transference goes certainly at a deeper level where people learn this, they internalize it. And as a result, um, there's a lot of stuff going on at the subconscious level of our minds that guide our behavior. And this is the place that we have to go to figure out, can I really bring forward these lessons from the past to this upcoming negotiation? Or was this also part of the reason why this negotiation didn't work? Was because I was trying to transfer a lesson from this previous situation to this one and it wasn't applicable. So there's a lot of importance that we have to place on what are the similarities and differences and how do I really learn them? There's a wonderful quote that I came across by a woman named Catherine Bartol at the University of Maryland, who said, "When you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation." Now, to a large degree, I agree with her. I certainly think there are things that we can transfer and approaches and different ways of doing things. But I think her point is that every negotiation has these variations that we've got to take into account. And when we don't, it's really easy to learn the wrong lesson and carry that forward and have it take you down a road that you don't want to go. So I would encourage you to think about your negotiation approach and how do you get more nuance, particularly as you look at negotiations that are very different from each other. You have to be very discerning in terms of what lessons you can transfer and what you can't as part of all this. And this whole conversation about lessons leads me to the idea of actively unlearning what your weaknesses taught you. And for me, like I said, this is something that I think is really, really valuable and important for negotiators to do because over time, we learn certain ideas, aspects, whatever it is, tactics, strategies related to negotiation. And I think it's fair for us to sort of say, did those things in some way, shape, or form get in the way, create the opportunity for a setback or a failure? And if so, why? And are some of these things that I've learned in the past still serving me today, or do I need to unlearn them? Peter Drucker, the management guru, said if you want to start doing something new, you have to stop doing something old. And I think there are some concepts that are valuable for us to unlearn. And I go into a number of them in the book. And to be very honest with you, I'm trying to be a bit provocative there to get you to think about what are those things that I believe form the core of my negotiation approach? And have I ever really evaluated those in great detail and said, maybe that's not serving my purposes? And you can see on your screen here that I've put a couple in there to play with. Okay. And the first one is sort of seeing the other negotiator as an adversary. And so in your book, um, there's a blank template here, but there's also one where I try to give you a few examples of what I mean. So the first one is this: your weakness is perhaps seeing the other negotiator as an adversary. Then why do I hold this view? Well, I learned that I've got to gain as much as I can in the short term and to deal with the long term later. Okay, maybe that's how you learned about negotiation. Maybe in your industry, that's the way you do things, right? But then what do you need to unlearn? That maybe negotiations are rarely short term and we can damage important relationships we're going to need with this approach. I'll give you one more. I don't need to go through all of these, but and I've written about this, and um, I think it's a very interesting conversation in our field to have about the notion of compromise. But I see so many people going into negotiation and viewing negotiation as synonymous with compromise, and that you are taught that you've got to give something up of great importance in order to reach an agreement. I remember I was, talking to somebody about this idea and about negotiation in general. And she said, to me, the best negotiation is where everybody leaves the table a bit unhappy. and that you've obviously got to give something up in order to get something. And I think for those of us who have worked in the interest-based world for quite a long time, we've seen a lot of examples where that's not the case. And in fact, that book that I wrote a number of years ago of the case studies demonstrates a lot of that, that there's often times where compromise is not necessary, but people rush to it quickly, especially when things get difficult, right? People will say, well, let's just split the difference and move on. And so, in many ways, compromise is expedient, but it doesn't produce the best results, right? So what you might need to unlearn is that compromise is a core aspect of all negotiations. I don't always have to give something up that's important to me to meet my objectives, right? And so have you explored all these possibilities, um, you know, before you compromise? That's the piece that I often will say to people is that, in your negotiations, you may have to get there. You may have to compromise, but that should be the very last stop on the train than the first, right? So this is what I mean by unlearning, okay? And what it really requires is an examination of who we are as a negotiator and what are those core pillars of what we believe and what we think. All right. So the last step is this idea of returning to the table smarter and stronger. And what that means is pretty simply so that there are two ways to return to the table. Okay. The first is if you've had a setback and you're ready to get back to the table or you can see a way back, one of the really important things from my point of view is don't wait for the other to reach out. Regardless of how the negotiation ended, you need to knock on the door first. I talk about the story of Nelson Mandela, who we all know that story of how he spent 27 years in jail. And when he came out, he reached out to Frederick de Klerk and said, hey, like, we need to get to the negotiating table and work this through. And so if Mandela can do that, even when we've dealt with a difficult, challenging negotiation, we should be able to do it as well. And the reason it's so important is we could wait forever for the other side to do it, and maybe they won't, right? So take the initiative, then start with them. What are the things that you learned from that previous process that are helpful here for you? And what do you still need to know that perhaps in hindsight you never got to, you never understood? That leads you to sort of think, what went wrong in that previous process, and how do you modify your approach? How do you, for example, if you tried to be persuasive to the other side using a logical approach, can you use more of a pathos-oriented storytelling way of doing things, thinking about what's going to resonate with them or not? Then if you've really failed and you can't get back to the table, the question is, how do you grow, right? As a negotiator, how do you use that failure to really help? So for me, and what I've learned in writing this book is a couple of things. The first is to really talk to your colleagues and say, help me to understand what you see here in terms of me as a negotiator and things like that. Help me make sense of what happened in this situation and take that unlearning seriously. There, I think, are genuinely some things in there that we can all unlearn that are holding us back. In the book, I also talk about some pieces of negotiation that are very difficult for the vast majority of us that get in the way a lot, like coping with the inherent uncertainty of negotiation and the ability to adapt, right? A lot of us struggle to really adapt and to think on our feet and prefer to engage more in planning. There are a number of things that are going to give you confidence, including seeing uncertainty differently and working on your adaptability. Those things can be done. It's not easy, but it's possible. And what I found is when you really focus in on some of these things, it really does help you when you get into these situations where you're not quite sure where to take something. We all have that experience where in negotiation, we don't always know where to go. And so when that happens, how do we manage? And let me just finish with this lesson of kintsugi, which is basically a Japanese concept that means joining with gold. And kintsugi is the art of um, taking something that's broken and putting it back together um, in a new and unique way that actually demonstrates sort of the broader philosophy of embracing the beauty of human flaws. So as you can see, this vase that's on your screen is broken. And instead of putting it together and trying to cover up the broken pieces, what Kintsugi basically talks about is no, use um, gold and other metals along with, adherent uh, tools to put things together and keep those breaks visible. Because what we learn as negotiators, without question, over time, is that um, this is kind of what we look like as negotiators. We all have our flaws, and instead of hiding them, and instead of not addressing them, wear them a little more proudly. Like, talk about them so that we can process them, and other people know that, hey, this is part of the deal. This is how negotiation works. And I found that when you are kind of that vulnerable as you teach people and things along those lines, there's a resonance with that because we know we all go through this. We know we all experience this. The question is, what do you do with it? So I'm going to stop there and try to save some time for some questions and comments. So really welcome them. And I want to thank everybody for listening in and turn it back over to Nicole to open up for questions.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Josh. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really enjoyed this book, and I recommend it to everyone. There is a lot that you touch on the techniques and the psychological aspects and self-introspection, which I think is so important. Not only in preparing for a negotiation, but as you're going through one, or when one has gone awry in some way.
Mhm.
So very much recommend to everyone. And I'm going to go to some of the questions that we have, but people, please feel free to add them into the Q&A. I'm going to paraphrase a question that we have from Dario, which is around how this work that you've done, Josh, on failure and setbacks and coming back to the table will inform your teaching and change it. Is this going to be, something that you're bringing up regularly as part of your curriculum? Is it, something where you're going to try to offer examples of failure to students so they can see also what went wrong and do that analysis?
Sure, and absolutely. So one of the classes that we actually teach in the Bay Path program is the psychology of leadership and negotiation. And so this book is going to be used there. And yeah, I actually am pretty open about the failures that I've had, and I in the book there are a couple of them that I share. So absolutely, and what I've found, and in particular, I also share them in the trainings that I do with companies and governments, et cetera. And when I do that, invariably people always come up to me at the breaks and say, "Can I share a failure with you that I had because it's been bugging me and I don't know what happened. I wasn't able to really process it, and frankly, I haven't really talked to anybody about it because I'm kind of embarrassed, et cetera." So without question, and I think for me, the kintsugi idea, like to me, that's how I want to do this because I think it's really realistic, and I want students to say, here's a failure that I had. Like, how do I really, you know, learn from this? So definitely.
Great. Um, you spoke about, Josh, the backfire effect, this tendency to dig in more because we are so averse to
Yeah.
loss. And can you talk about how we can counteract that, like before, as something starts to go off the rails, or what we
Mm.
can do mentally to refocus ourselves?
Yeah. And in the book, I actually share an example of a somebody who goes to a venture capitalist and has a product that they have been working hard on, and the venture capitalist really kind of shoots their idea down quickly. And the response from, the person who had the product is to insult them, blame them, etc., and to try to double down and just start throwing more information, more data at them in the hopes that they can convince them, even though it's really clear that they're not going to be able to. So I think that the most important thing with the backfire effect is, why are you holding on so tightly? If someone is sharing evidence with you that perhaps what you're saying or the perspective that you have, might have some holes in it, like, take in the criticism and think about what you can do with it. Because in some ways, and in particular in that VC example, had he taken that in, there might have very well been something that he could have used to improve his product. Actually, the venture capitalist said, I don't understand how your product is really differentiated from others out there. Right. So I think the answer is to say, well, okay, so tell me, like, why don't you see a differentiation here, as opposed to, you're not getting it. You don't understand the uniqueness of my product, which is what the response was, as opposed to, well, wait a minute, tell me more.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
That's
Great.
generally how I would do it. And I think how you counteract the backfire effect is to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
open to and not feel like you have to sort of defend your position, so to speak.
Right. And I agree that there's so much, you touch on unlearning, and that's a big component of the of your book, unlearning certain intuitions that we have, unlearning things that we think that we've been taught. And so the next two questions that I'm going to synthesize, I
Yeah.
think go to that. And one is on, you definitely touched on it, this idea that negotiation is a compromise,
Yeah.
and always means giving something up. So if you could talk about how we unlearn that and where the shift is, I think for some people this will be obvious, but for others, it's really the very basic premise of what a negotiation is.
So yeah, look, here's the thing for me when it comes to compromise and I actually wrote a short article on LinkedIn about this because I've said this a lot and people have reached out and said, well, what do you mean, right, when you say that? And so I tried to get more specific about when should you compromise and when shouldn't you? And I think for most of us, we can think of a time in our negotiations where our objective was in front of us and it was really critical and we gave up on it to reach a deal. Okay. To me, that's exactly how you don't want to compromise, right? You want to be open to figuring out how do I get there? But again, if your goal in negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible, not to reach agreement, right? Like to me, that's your goal. Like you have an objective when you go into negotiation. And if you can reach an agreement that satisfies that, you should do that. But if someone's asking you to give up on that central objective, then compromising really runs counter to it. And, you I know I've done that in the past and I've walked out and I've kicked myself and I've said, I can't believe I did that just to reach an agreement. So there are places where you could look at it and say, well, okay, if that's not my core objective. Okay, I can let go of that. I can compromise there. But when it comes to my values, when it comes to the thing that's at the heart of this negotiation, if I compromise, I'm really engaging in a process where I've actually sort of had self-defeating behavior because
Mhm.
it sort of runs counter to what I'm supposed to be doing in this particular situation. So, and I think there are all these interesting examples that we've seen, in getting TS and beyond, where people have talked about how, the example that I reiterate in the book is about the window in the library. And, a compromise solution for those who don't know, there's a person in the library and the window is open and um, one person wants the window open, the other person wants it closed. They get into an argument. The librarian comes over and says, "Why do you want this?" And um, one person says, "I'm getting tired. I need the fresh air." The other person says, you know, "The window's open and the wind is blowing my papers everywhere." Right? A compromise solution there would be to close the window halfway. Doesn't really help the person whose papers are getting blown everywhere. Right? But the librarian thinks creatively, goes to the next aisle, opens it, and achieves the same objective. So I think to me, it's about replacing compromise with problem solving. So to me, I believe negotiation is really at its heart about creative problem solving. And if you engage in compromise too quickly, you don't give creative problem solving a chance. You're rushing quickly to compromise and saying, let's just do that as opposed to, and let me put it to you this way, okay? I've seen lots of people who will compromise and I'll say, did you actually know what was really critical for the other side when you
Yeah.
compromised? And they'll say, no. And I'll say, well, how can you possibly start giving things up at that point when you don't even know what's really possible? So that's the concern, and that's the part that I think people really need to unlearn. You can always, by the way, as I say to folks who do want to sort of hang on to this a little, you can always compromise, right? Just make it the last stop on the train, not the first.
After all the value creation,
Yeah,
important.
right.
Yeah,
Or the
absolutely.
effort to create value, right? There might not be in some cases. And in that situation, you might want to do that. But the other piece, when compromise does make sense, is when expediency is important. And when you're under a time pressure, you may not have the opportunity to do, all of the creative problem solving. So I get it. And it's not a black and white thing. It's just a slow down on the compromise and give the creative problem solving a chance to see where you can get.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I mentioned that I was going to ask about two intuitions, Josh, and I think the other one that we have a question about is someone who is asking, why is it that experience is not the best teacher? And I think it's clear from the book, but could you go into that a little bit more? Because I think some of us think that, oh, if we've been doing this for a long time, that absolutely means that our wealth of experience is contributing to our success. But you very clearly demonstrate why that's not always true.
So in the reality is, and the quote that I shared, I think gets at it, right? Which is that we can have these experiences, but we can also sort of just walk through them without ever really saying, do I understand exactly what happened here? And so that quote by John Maxwell, it's evaluated experience that's critical, right? So we have these experiences as negotiators, but doing a postmortem and really saying, wait a minute, like what really happened? And I remember on a couple of different occasions where I was doing some training and people came up to me and said, and I would mention that, you really need to understand what happened. And it's not enough to just sort of say, I had that experience. And they would come up and say, what did you mean by that? And what I would say is you've got to take a lot of time and say, what really happened here? And what do I take away? That's a different conversation than just having gone through it and experienced it. And what I found when I would actually sit down with those folks after a training or at lunch, I'd be like, I would push them. And what I noticed was that they came to a different understanding because what we were doing was really evaluating their experience. We weren't just, walking through a field. We were stopping to look at the different kind of flowers in the field and saying, what does this one do? And why does this one grow here and not over there, right? That kind of an analogy. And so for me, that's the difference. And it just means having that experience, not taking it for granted and digging deeper into it and saying, what does it really mean that you've now had this experience? And what does it mean for your practice or your teaching or whatever related to negotiation?
Mm, yeah, great. Well, actually, that came to another question that we had, which is there are a lot of supervisors, managers on our call, and
Uh-huh.
we have a question about how one as a manager or supervisor can coach subordinates through the lessons that are in the book and by using failure. So, and identifying weaknesses and points where we could improve.
Well, the first thing that I would say is you have to make failure okay, right? If people in your organization don't feel like they can talk about or bring to you that this didn't work out without feeling like there's going to be retribution or a consequence, really negative consequence, they're not going to do it and they're not going to listen. So I think you have to create a little bit of a culture. It's not like you're promoting failure. It's that you're saying to people, this is going to happen. Like bring it to us so that we as a collective organization can learn. So normalize it a bit and make it okay for people to come to you. I've worked with a couple of different companies for a long time, one for 28 years, and they are the best that I've ever seen at saying to folks, hey, we know this isn't always going to work out. Let's figure out why. Let's take the time. Let's do brown bags. And I do a lot of them with them where we take a scenario that didn't work and we say, what happened? Right. So that's, I think, the key is so that people feel like I don't have to hide it. I don't have to sugarcoat it. I don't have to make it sound better than it was. What I need to do is face the cold, hard facts about what happened and be able to talk it through so that the next time around, I'll really have learned from that. And I also think moving from theory to practice is really helpful here.
Mm,
People can get these ideas, right? But like put it into the context of a negotiation that didn't work and say, what, like, okay, like, let's talk about what happened here and why you struggled. Where do you think you ran into a problem? So that, and my friend and colleague Sheila Heen, in their book, Thanks for the Feedback, right? Like that's part of what you're doing here is, set it up so it's coaching. It's not evaluation. It's we're going to help you to improve. That's why we're doing this. So those would be some of the things normalize and then, try to have that conversation in a coaching kind of way so that that person who already feels, um, hurt, challenged, maybe a little bit inadequate because they failed, um, can engage with you and is willing to say, like, for the benefit of everybody in our organization, let me share what happened. And, and that takes, honestly, like takes courage for someone to say that. It's not easy. And I don't mean to make this sound easy, but it is, I think, the way that you really learn from it and
Yeah.
your organization
Courage
does.
to say that and to receive it well, right? Which is also what that book is about. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
right.
Um, Josh, we were talking about the failure in the workplace environment. We have a number of questions from people saying, okay, but what if this is with my family, right? And, this is not, I can't change families. This is a sustained relationship. And
Yeah.
how can we approach setbacks in these long-term relationships that have huge emotional components? So is there anything that you would say specifically for that kind of home context?
I mean, this is in many ways, this is all the more reason to do this, because these are the relationships that are most important to us in our lives, right? And when we fail, we can just walk away, or we can try to, or we can stay the course. And let me give you a personal example. My dad actually just passed away 10 days ago.
I'm so
Um,
sorry.
Thank you. And I dedicated the book to him because my father, he was a very successful doctor, but he had to retire early, and he ended up having a lot of challenges in his life that demonstrated the resilience and things along those lines. And there were moments, he and I had a father-son relationship, which had some problems with it. And but we stayed with it. And in the last few years of his life, we found a much better place. Now, there were times where I sensed he wanted to walk away, and I was like, I'm not letting you because I have one father. But more importantly, we got there, right? And so when my father passed away, I would have been devastated had we not. And what I notice is that because of this kind of the stuff that's in the book, like, we went through a lot of that together without really calling it that. Um, and it requires a persistence. It requires a sort of resiliency in your relationship. And that's actually, for me, what the book is all about, is to say, hey, this is going to happen, especially with those people that you care most about in your life. And so these are exactly the relationships that you can't quit on, that you
Mhm.
have to work at. And you have to recognize, you know what, you're not perfect, and neither are they. And that's okay. Like, stay with the process, but look
Mhm.
at yourself, like, what you're contributing to the problem, just like they are.
Mhm.
And so I think this is exactly, in some ways, yes, this kind of stuff, of course, happens in the world writ large, in businesses, but it absolutely happens in your families as well. So
Yeah.
that's my take on it, and I'm
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
grateful that I got there with him, because there were a lot of failures along the way that we had to work through.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And we have a number of people commenting that they're very sorry for your loss and appreciate that you're here in such a precious moment. And Josh, I think it's also the dedication was very beautiful because you described your father as a lifelong learner. And I think a lot of what this book is showing us how to be lifelong learners in the context of our own negotiations and to keep taking those failures and in the Kintsugi way, showcasing them and honoring them, and then moving forward despite all of that. So that's very lovely. And I'm afraid we're pretty much at time. This has been a really wonderful and engaging conversation. Everyone, we've put Josh Weiss's contact information in the chat. So if you want to continue the conversation, I know there were many questions that we're not able to get to in the span of an hour, but really encourage you to read the book and also check out Josh's previous works also. We did put links to those in the chat. And Josh, thank you so much for your time today. We are deeply appreciative as ever. Everyone, we will be scheduling some other events. We actually have some on our calendars that will be shortly up on the website so that you can check these out. If you joined us late, please look at the events page in just a couple of days and you'll be able to review the recording or share it with someone else. And we will have future events quite soon. We hope to see you at those or in person on one of our programs here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So thank you to everyone and be well.